October 14, 1918. The woman's name was Dorothy Elkins, and she was 22 years old, and her skin had turned the color of a ripe lemon. Not jaundiced, not pale, yellow. A deep, sulphurous, unmistakable yellow that started at the hairline and worked its way down the throat, across the collarbone, into the creases of her palms. Her co-workers called it the canary tint. They said it like a joke. They laughed about it in the changing rooms of the Penniman explosive loading plant in York County, Virginia, where 12,000 workers, most of them women, packed trinitrotoluene into artillery shells for the United States Army 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, without masks, without ventilation, without being told what the yellow meant. Dorothy Elkins collapsed on the loading floor at 6:47 in the morning, between Shell Line C and Shell Line D, in a building the Army had designated Structure Number 44. She was carried to the plant infirmary by 2 men who were also yellow. The plant physician, a contractor employed not by the government but by E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, noted in his log, mild systemic reaction, worker returned to duty within 48 hours. She was not returned to duty. She died 11 days later in Newport News, Virginia, of toxic hepatitis, a condition the plant physician had not written down, and that the United States Army, in the 43 years that followed, would not once publicly acknowledge had been caused by the facility at Penniman. The facility itself no longer exists. Not just closed, not just demolished, erased. Today, where 12,000 Americans once built the most powerful explosive manufacturing complex in the Western Hemisphere, there is a marina, pleasure boats, the smell of sunscreen and outboard motor fuel. Tourists who have never heard of Penniman, Virginia, because no one ever told them it was there. This is the story of what they built there, and what they did to the people who built it. The war started for America on April 6, 1917. And the problem became clear within 3 weeks. The United States Army had committed to fielding 2 million soldiers on the Western Front within 18 months. 2 million soldiers required rifles. Rifles required cartridges. Cartridges required powder. Artillery required shells. Shells required high explosive. High explosive in quantities large enough to matter, quantities measured in tens of thousands of tons, required a manufacturing infrastructure that the United States did not have, had never needed to have, and could not improvise overnight. The entire domestic TNT output of the United States in the spring of 1917 was approximately 300 tons per month. The Army's projected monthly requirement was 27,000. The gap between those two numbers is the reason Penniman exists. General William Crozier, the Army's Chief of Ordnance, sat in his office in Washington in April of 1917 and understood that the war would be decided not on the fields of France, but in the factories of America. He was a precise man, a West Point man, a man who had spent a career thinking about the mechanics of destruction. He looked at the gap, 300 tons versus 27,000, and he made one phone call. He called Pierre Samuel DuPont. DuPont was not merely a chemical company in 1917, it was the chemical company. It had been supplying the United States military with black powder since 1802. It had modernized American explosives manufacturing during the Civil War. It had already been producing TNT for the British and French since 1914, expanding its facilities in Delaware and New Jersey, while the rest of American industry debated whether the European conflict was any of their business. When Crozier called, DuPont's executives did not ask whether they could do it. They asked where. The answer came from a site survey team that fanned out across the mid-Atlantic in the spring of 1917, looking for certain specific things: deep water access for receiving chemical inputs by barge, rail connections for output, isolation from population centers, not for the workers' sake, because TNT plants exploded, and an explosion in a populated area would end careers and possibly the war effort, and flat land, enormous quantities of flat land. They found it on the York River Peninsula in Virginia, a wedge of tidewater lowland between the York and the James, where the soil was red clay and pine and not much else. The village of Penniman had a post office and a general store and approximately 200 residents. Within 6 months, it would have 15,000. Ground was broken on September 1, 1917. The first shell was loaded on March 12, 1918. In between, DuPont built a city. Not a factory, a city. 247 buildings, a rail yard with 17 miles of track, a water treatment plant, a hospital with 180 beds, a movie theater, a school, dormitories and boarding houses, and a YMCA and a cafeteria capable of feeding 3,000 workers per shift. The facility covered 4,200 acres, ran along nearly 3 miles of York River waterfront, and required so much electrical power that DuPont built its own generating station, fired by coal barges that came up the river from Norfolk twice a week. The construction cost was $34 million in 1917 dollars. The federal government paid every cent of it and handed the completed facility to DuPont to operate, and did not publicize the arrangement, and did not explain to the 12,000 workers who began arriving in the winter of 1918 exactly what they would be paid to do. They would be paid to turn yellow. The Penniman plant at its peak in the summer of 1918 operated 4 distinct production lines simultaneously around the clock, 365 days a year, and the noise of it was audible from the far side of the York River on still nights. Walk through the main gate on the morning shift, the 5:45 whistle, and the smell hit you first. Not one smell, a column of smells, stacked like floors in a building. Down at the base, the chemical tang of toluene feedstock coming off the processing vats, sharp and organic and wrong in the back of the throat. Above that, the heavy iron smell of the shell castings, 3-inch, 4.5-inch, and 6-inch artillery rounds stacked in their wooden crates like eggs in an enormous gray carton. Above that, something harder to name, a smell like burnt sugar crossed with something metallic, the particular olfactory signature of trinitrotoluene in solution, which is what the workers called the dip bath, the heated vats of dissolved TNT through which the shell bodies were passed before the explosive cooled and crystallized inside the casing. The dip bath workers were almost always women, young women, most of them. The foreman preferred them because their hands were smaller and more precise, and because they would accept the wages that men would not. $3.20 a day in 1918. The foreman did not mention the yellowing. New workers noticed it on the older ones, the faint sulfurous tint of the forearms, the more pronounced color at the neckline, and asked about it, and were told it was the lighting in the loading sheds. Sodium vapor made everybody look a little off. This was a lie that the plant physician, working under contract to DuPont, had been briefed to tell. Inside the loading sheds, the machines were massive and very loud. The shell lines ran on conveyor systems salvaged from automotive plants in Detroit and modified for the purpose, and they moved the empty casings through the production sequence at a rate of approximately 800 shells per hour per line. Workers stood at fixed stations and performed single repetitive operations, operating the fill valve, checking the seal, stenciling the lot number for their entire 12-hour shift without sitting down. The floor vibrated constantly, not from the machines, from the shells themselves, which were filled under mechanical pressure and which produced a low subsonic hum that the workers felt in their feet and shins, and which, after several months of daily exposure, manifested as a peculiar tingling in the extremities that the plant physician called occupational vibration fatigue, and which was, in fact, early-stage peripheral neuropathy caused by TNT absorption through the skin. Not one worker was told this. James Hollis Mitchell, 41, of Gloucester County, Virginia, had been a waterman before the war, crabber, oysterman, a man who had spent 30 years on the York River and knew its moods the way he knew his own hands. He came to Penniman in February of 1918 because the daily wage was more than he made in 3 days on the water. He was assigned to the nitration unit, where toluene was processed into TNT through successive chemical baths of sulfuric and nitric acid, and where the vapor concentrations were highest and the ventilation was worst. By April, he was yellow. By June, his wife, writing from Gloucester in careful block letters because she had not had much schooling, noted in a letter that he was yellow as a canary in a coal mine and tired in a way that sleep don't fix. By August, he was dead. Toxic hepatitis. The death certificate listed the cause as hepatic insufficiency, etiology undetermined. His wife received no compensation from DuPont. She received no letter from the Army. She received a form from the Selective Service Administration noting that her husband had been exempted from military service due to his essential war industry employment, and that therefore no survivor's benefits applied. She kept the form. Her granddaughter still has it. James Hollis Mitchell was not the only one. The plant physician's logs, partially declassified in 1961 and more fully in 1989, document 847 cases of significant TNT-related illness at Penniman between March and November of 1918. 31 deaths. The Army's own internal reports from the same period, released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the early 1980s, estimate the true illness figure at closer to 2,200 workers, with the discrepancy attributable to the plant physician's consistent practice of attributing symptoms to non-occupational causes. The production continued. The shells went to France. Some of them, in the fall of 1918, helped break the Hindenburg Line. The Army later called Penniman one of the decisive industrial achievements of the American war effort. In the official histories, the 12,000 workers at Penniman are described as patriotic volunteers performing essential service. The word TNT does not appear in the same sentence as the words sickness or death in any official Army document published before 1975. The facility ran at full production until November 11, 1918, the day the armistice was signed in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne. They shut the lines down, the same afternoon. What happened next is the part of the story that they really didn't want you to know. DuPont's contract with the United States Army for the operation of the Penniman facility included a standard war emergency clause. Upon cessation of hostilities, the federal government retained the right to terminate the contract with 60 days' notice. The notice came on November 13, 1918, 2 days after the armistice. The 60 days expired on January 12, 1919. By January 15th, DuPont had removed its corporate records, its operational data, its safety logs, its physician's files, and its proprietary process documentation from the Penniman site. All of it went to Wilmington, Delaware, to the DuPont Corporate Archive, where most of it remained inaccessible to researchers until the 1980s, and portions of which have never been released. The 12,000 workers received no severance. Federal contracting law in 1919 did not require it. They received their final wages and a form letter from the Secretary of War's office thanking them for their contribution to the victory and informing them that the facility was no longer in operation. The workers who were still yellow received the same form letter as everyone else. Many of them had come from elsewhere, from the Tidewater farms in the coal counties of West Virginia and the textile mills of North Carolina, and they had no particular home to return to. Some stayed in the dormitories for weeks after the shutdown. The Army eventually hired local contractors to clear the dormitories in February of 1919. The workers who were sick, the ones whose livers were failing, whose peripheral nerves had been damaged, whose kidneys were showing the specific scarring pattern that TNT nephropathy produces, had no legal avenue of redress. The plant physician's records did not support their claims. The Army's position, maintained consistently until 1975, was that no systematic occupational illness had occurred at Penniman. The buildings came down fast. DuPont had built them fast, and they came down the same way. The manufacturing structures were demolished first because they contained residual explosive contamination and because the Army wanted them gone before anyone with a notebook showed up to document the condition of the site. The residential structures followed: the hospital, the movie theater, the YMCA. By 1922, Penniman was gone, not closed, gone. The Army sold the land in parcels, the rail lines were torn up, the docks on the York River were removed. The road that had led to the main gate was allowed to deteriorate until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding pine woods. No marker was placed, no monument erected. No record in the county courthouse identified the location. The 1920 census for York County lists the Penniman post office as inactive. There is no entry for the facility itself. There is no entry for the 31 workers who died there because they had not died in York County. They had died in the Newport News Hospital, or on the train home, or in farmhouses in Gloucester County, or in rented rooms in Norfolk, far enough from Penniman that the connection was easy not to make. The connection was easy not to make, and so it was not made. The Army did not make it. DuPont did not make it. The men and women who came home yellow and tired in a way that sleep didn't fix tried to explain to their families and their doctors what had happened to them, and found that there was no language for it, no official acknowledgement against which to anchor their experience. And so most of them said nothing, and died in the order that TNT hepatitis and TNT nephropathy dictated, which was not quickly. It was not quickly at all. Today, the site of the Penniman explosive loading plant is occupied partly by the Penniman Road residential development and partly by the York River Yacht Haven Marina, where on a summer weekend you can rent a slip for your boat and buy a sandwich at the dock store and watch the water move in the particular way that York River water moves, brown and tidal and slow. The ground under the marina parking lot contains residual contamination from the 1917 and 1918 operations. A 1993 Virginia Department of Environmental Quality survey found trace concentrations of TNT degradation products in the soil at depths consistent with the original building footprints. The survey recommended further study. The further study was not conducted. The parking lot was paved. There is a historical marker on Route 17, 4 miles from the site, that mentions Penniman in a single sentence as a World War I production facility. It does not mention DuPont. It does not mention the workers. It does not mention the 31 dead or the 2,000 sick or the documents that spent 40 years in a Wilmington archive while the people they described aged into their graves. The marker is made of aluminum, machine-stamped. It flexes in the wind off the York River with a thin metallic rattle, the cheapest possible acknowledgement that something happened here. In the town of Gloucester, Virginia, across the river, there is a family that keeps a form letter from the Selective Service Administration dated December 1918. They keep it in a plastic sleeve in a cedar chest in a back bedroom. They know roughly what it means, that a man named James Mitchell worked at a place called Penniman and died and left nothing behind except a wife and 3 children and a letter that proved the government knew he existed. They don't know the rest. Nobody told them the rest. Nobody built the monument. Nobody held the ceremony. Nobody walked into the rooms where the records were kept and said, "These people worked here. They were poisoned here. They died here. Their names are these." They deserved better than a parking lot and a form letter and a thin aluminum sign flexing in the wind. The York River moves past the marina at the same speed it has always moved. Brown water, tidal and slow. On a quiet morning, you can stand at the dock and look across to where Penniman was and hear nothing except the creak of the boat lines and the birds going about their business and the sound of 12,000 names that no one ever said out loud. That sound is the loudest thing in the world, if you know how to listen for it.